I never thought the sound that would change my whole life would be this small, this quiet, almost lost under the wind moving through the apple trees. A thin, hiccuping cry coming from a laundry basket sitting on my porch at 11 o'clock at night, wrapped in a blue blanket with a folded piece of paper pinned to the fabric that read, in handwriting so shaky it barely looked human, "He's yours now. Please, I'm sorry." And for a full minute I stood in my own doorway in bare feet, with the cold October air biting at my ankles, and I could not make my legs move. Because the thing about grief is that it doesn't leave when the years pass. It just learns to stay quiet. And in that 1 minute, staring down at a baby I had never seen before, every locked door inside me came open at once. Because 5 years earlier I had held a baby just like this one, my own son, for exactly 11 minutes before the doctors took him away and told me there was nothing more they could do, and my wife Margaret didn't survive the night either. And I had spent every year since telling myself that some men just aren't built to hold on to a family, that mine had been given to me and taken back before I even learned how to be a father. And now here was another one, red-faced and furious at the cold, kicking one small foot out of the blanket like he had something to prove. And I didn't know his name. I didn't know his mother. I didn't know anything except that I couldn't leave him on that porch 1 second longer, so I picked him up, and he stopped crying the moment my hands closed around him. And that quiet, that sudden, trusting quiet, undid something in me that I had spent 5 years trying to keep bolted shut. My name is Owen Hale. I'm 32 years old, and I run an apple orchard on the edge of a town called Rivergate, Vermont. 60 acres my Aunt Margaret Hale left me when she passed. The same Margaret whose name I gave to my wife because she was the one who raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 9. The same Margaret who used to say a farm without people in the house is just land waiting to be lonely. And I had proven her right for longer than I wanted to admit. But let me take you back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense unless you understand what my aunt asked of me before she died 2 years ago, and what that laundry basket on my porch actually meant. Aunt Margaret raised horses and apples, and me, in that order she used to joke, and about 6 years before she died, she took in a girl named Claire Bennett, the daughter of a cousin who couldn't raise her, and Claire lived with us for 2 summers, a quiet, watchful teenager who used to sit on the porch steps reading while I fixed fences. And I remembered her as a kid with paint-stained fingers who wanted to be an artist and who flinched whenever anyone raised their voice. And then she went off to live with her father's side of the family in Boston, and I hadn't thought about her in years. Not until the last week of Aunt Margaret's life, when she was too weak to sit up on her own, and she gripped my hand with more strength than I thought she had left and said, "Owen, if that girl Claire ever comes back around here needing help, you help her? Do you hear me? She's got people in her life who'll smile at her and take everything she has. And I need you to be the kind of man who doesn't." And I promised her I would, the way you promise a dying woman anything, without fully understanding what I was agreeing to, and then I buried her under the maple tree behind the house and went back to running the orchard alone. And Claire Bennett became a name I hadn't heard in 2 years, until the night she left her son on my porch without even knocking on the door. I sat in the kitchen most of that night with the baby against my chest, because every time I set him down in the basket, he startled awake. And I read the note over and over under the lamp. "He's yours now, please, I'm sorry. No name, no phone number, nothing except a small folded photograph tucked inside the blanket. A picture of Claire, older now, 24 maybe, standing in front of a building I didn't recognize, smiling in a way that didn't reach her eyes. And on the back, in the same shaking handwriting, it said, 'His name is Eli, he was born September 3rd. Please don't let them find him.' And that line, 'Please don't let them find him,' sat in my chest like a stone for the rest of the night, because it meant somebody out there was looking, and it meant this wasn't a woman who didn't want her son. It was a woman who was scared enough to give him to a near stranger rather than keep him near whatever she was running from. I called the sheriff first thing that morning, because that's what you're supposed to do. And Sheriff Daniel Reyes came out to the farm himself, a heavy-set man I'd known my whole life. And he sat at my kitchen table holding Eli while I made coffee neither of us drank. And he told me that legally I had to report an abandoned infant, that there'd be a welfare check, possibly child services, possibly a search for the mother. And I told him everything, the note, the photograph, my aunt's dying request, and Daniel rubbed his jaw and said, "Owen, if this girl really is running from somebody dangerous, calling this in the wrong way could get her found faster than getting her help. Let me make some quiet calls first." And for 3 days I lived in a strange, terrifying peace. Taking care of a baby I had no legal right to, learning how to warm a bottle and support a wobbling neck and function on 2 hours of sleep. And somewhere in those 3 days I stopped thinking of it as an emergency and started thinking of it as my life. And that terrified me more than the idea of losing him ever could. On the 4th night, I heard a car in the driveway that wasn't Daniel's cruiser. And I stepped onto the porch with Eli asleep against my shoulder and saw a woman standing beside a rusted sedan with Massachusetts plates, her arms wrapped around herself even though it wasn't that cold. And it took me a second to recognize her because the girl I remembered had round cheeks and paint on her fingers. And the woman standing in my driveway looked like she hadn't slept in a week, thin in a way that worried me, a bruise fading yellow-green along her jaw that she hadn't quite managed to cover. And when she saw the baby in my arms, her whole body folded forward like her knees had given out. And she said, in a voice that barely made it across the yard, "You kept him." I said her name, Claire, and she flinched exactly the way she used to flinch as a teenager. And she said, "I didn't know where else to take him. Margaret used to say you were the only person she trusted completely. And I've been driving for 3 days trying to convince myself I made the right choice leaving him here." And I told her to come inside before she said another word. Because whatever this was, it wasn't a conversation for a driveway at midnight. Inside, under the kitchen light, I could see it better, the exhaustion, the fear that sat behind her eyes like something permanently installed. And she wouldn't sit down until I put Eli in her arms. And the second she held him, something in her seemed to come back online, some part of her that had been running on empty. And she pressed her face into the blanket and cried without making a sound. The kind of crying that's been held back so long it doesn't know how to be loud anymore. And I sat across from her and waited. Because I remembered enough about grief to know that pushing someone to talk before they're ready just makes them run again. When she finally spoke, the story came out in pieces. She'd gone to Boston to live with her father, who had remarried into money, the Ashfords, a family whose name was on 3 buildings downtown. And her father had wanted her to marry well the way you'd want a stock to perform well, and she'd fallen instead for a man named Weston Ashford, her stepbrother in name only since there was no blood between them, and their families had been thrilled, a merger dressed up as a romance. And then Claire got pregnant before the wedding, and instead of joy, what she got was a closed-door meeting with Weston's mother. Diane Ashford, a woman Claire described with a kind of flat, exhausted fear, who told her that a baby born before the wedding was a scandal, the family could not survive in the society pages, and that the solution was simple. Claire would disappear for a few months to a discreet facility upstate, have the baby quietly, and the child would be raised by a hired arrangement under the Ashford name while Claire and Weston married on schedule as though none of it had happened. And when Claire refused, the pressure became something else. Weston's hand around her arm hard enough to bruise, Diane's voice going cold and precise, telling her that if she tried to leave with the baby, they had lawyers who could prove she was unstable, unfit, that they would take Eli and raise him properly, and there would be nothing a broke 24-year-old artist could do about it. And Claire had believed her, because the Ashfords had never once in her experience failed to get exactly what they wanted. And so 3 nights ago she had packed 1 bag, taken her son, and driven until the fear got too loud to keep driving with a baby in the car. And the only safe name she could think of in the whole world was mine. "I believe you," I said before she'd even finished. And she looked up at me like those words physically hurt, the way people do when they've been doubted so many times that belief feels like an ambush. And she said, "You don't even know me anymore. I was a kid the last time you saw me," and I said, "I knew your Aunt Margaret's judgment. And she trusted you enough to make me promise to look after you. That's enough for me." And Claire put her hand over her mouth and cried again, quieter this time. And Eli stirred against her shoulder and she rocked him without seeming to think about it, an instinct that had clearly kept both of them alive for 3 days on the road. That night I gave her Margaret's old room, the one with the window that looks out over the orchard. and I lay awake a long time listening to the house hold 2 extra heartbeats for the first time in 5 years. And somewhere around 3 in the morning, I heard Eli start to fuss, and I heard Claire's feet on the floor, and her voice, low and cracked with exhaustion, singing something I didn't recognize. And I lay there in the dark and understood that whatever happened next, I was not going to be able to let this family walk back out into danger alone. The next morning, we sat at the kitchen table and worked out what I can only call an arrangement, though it felt too large a word for something that mattered so much. Claire had no money, no lawyer, and a family with more resources than either of us could imagine, looking for a way to take her son and erase her from the story entirely. And I had land, a name in this county that meant something, and a promise made to a dying woman I loved. And so I said the thing before I let myself think too hard about it. I said, marry me, not for romance, for protection. If you're my wife and Eli is legally recognized as living in a stable home with 2 parents, it's a lot harder for the Ashfords to walk into a courtroom and call you unfit. We do it on paper first. You and Eli have somewhere safe that no lawyer can argue you don't belong. And whatever happens between us after that is up to us. No pressure, no strings. And Claire stared at me across the table with an expression I couldn't read. And she said, you don't even know if this baby will grow up looking like you. People will ask questions, and I said, let them ask. And something in her face cracked open. Not into tears this time, but into something that looked almost like relief. Like she had been braced for the whole world to keep asking her to be smaller. And here was one person asking her to take up more space instead. We married 2 weeks later at the county courthouse, Daniel Reyes and his wife as witnesses. Claire in a plain green dress she'd had in her bag. Eli asleep in a carrier against my chest through the entire 5-minute ceremony. And when the clerk asked if I took Claire Bennett to be my wife, I said I do and meant it as a promise about the next 50 years, even though neither of us had said the word love out loud yet. And that night, back at the farm, we sat on the porch steps where she used to read as a teenager. Eli finally asleep upstairs, and Claire said quietly into the dark, I keep waiting for you to ask for something in return. And I said I made a promise to a woman who raised me. This is me keeping it. And Claire was quiet a long moment and then said, my father used to say love is just leverage people haven't collected on yet. And I said, then I feel sorry for your father, because he never got to see what it actually looks like. And she laughed. A small, surprised sound like she'd forgotten she still had one in her. The weeks that followed found their own rhythm. The kind of rhythm a house only earns once there are people in it who intend to stay. Claire cooking breakfast in a kitchen that had gone stale with silence for 2 years. Cracking eggs one-handed while Eli sat propped in a bouncer on the counter, watching her like she was the most interesting thing he'd ever seen. And I'd come in from the barn smelling like hay and diesel, and she'd hand me coffee without either of us saying a word about it. The way people do once a routine has quietly become a marriage in more than name. Eli's laugh became the loudest sound in a house that used to only hold the tick of the wall clock and the wind against the shutters, and I found myself inventing reasons to walk past the studio just to hear it. The shed I'd cleared out for her easel and her canvases, sawdust and turpentine and the smell of dry apples all mixing together into something that started to smell like home instead of just land. Claire dragged that easel out to the orchard fence some afternoons and painted the trees in a way that made me see land I'd walked every single day of my life like I was looking at it for the first time. The low autumn light catching the rows different than I'd ever noticed. And she'd hold up a canvas half-finished and say, tell me honestly. And I never had the heart to tell her honestly that I wasn't looking at the painting half as much as I was looking at her concentrating over it. Tongue caught between her teeth, hair falling loose from the knot she always tied it in. There were quiet mornings where I'd find her humming while she nursed the baby by the window. Some tune I never recognized. Maybe something her own mother used to sing before she died, and something in my chest would ache in a way that had nothing to do with grief anymore. An ache that felt more like a door swinging open than a wound reopening. There were nights I woke to Eli crying 2 rooms away and found myself already halfway down the hall before I was even fully awake. Feet moving on instinct I hadn't built over years the way most fathers do. Something new and urgent and entirely mine. And more than once I'd meet Claire in the hallway in the dark. both of us reaching for the same doorknob, and she'd just laugh softly and say, "I've got him. Go back to sleep. You've got the East Field at 5." And I'd stand there a second longer than I needed to, just watching her carry him back to bed, thinking that I had spent 5 years convinced a family was something that only ever got taken from me. And here it was, being handed back to me a little at a time by two people who had never once asked me to earn it. But the peace didn't last, because Diane Ashford was not a woman who let go of things quietly. 3 weeks after the wedding, a car with Massachusetts plates pulled into town, not into my driveway, but into the diner on Main Street where everybody in Rivergate eventually passes through, and by that evening, Daniel Reyes was standing on my porch, hat in his hands, telling me that a man in a gray suit who didn't belong anywhere near Rivergate had been showing a photograph around the diner, asking the waitress and two of the regulars if they'd seen a young woman with dark hair and a newborn passing through town in the last month, and that the waitress, bless her, had told him she couldn't recall a thing, and then called Daniel the second the man walked out the door. And I stood there on my own porch with my heart going hard in my chest, because the last time I'd stood in that exact spot, a stranger's fear had been left in a laundry basket at my feet. And now it felt like that fear had finally caught up to where it was hiding. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the kitchen with the lights off and the shotgun my Aunt Margaret kept behind the pantry door within reach. Not because I expected trouble to come walking up the driveway, but because for the first time since Claire arrived, I understood, really understood in my body and not just in my head, that this wasn't a story about an inconvenient scandal for a wealthy family. It was a story about a woman and a baby that a powerful family considered property they'd misplaced. And people like that don't stop looking just because you've hidden well. 2 days after that, an envelope arrived by courier. Thick, expensive paper, a letter from an Ashford family attorney informing Claire that they were filing a custody petition in Vermont Family Court, alleging that the child, Eli Ashford, and I want you to notice they had already renamed him in their own paperwork, had been removed from a stable prenatal care arrangement by a mother with documented instability and placed in the home of a man she had known for less than a month, and that the family sought immediate custody pending investigation. And Claire read the letter standing in the kitchen, and her hands shook so hard the paper made a sound like wind through dry leaves. And she said, "They're going to say I'm unfit. They're going to say this marriage is fake. They have 3 lawyers for every dollar we have." And I took the letter from her hands and I said, "Then we get a 4th lawyer, and a 5th, and we make sure every single person in that courtroom understands exactly who's really unstable in this story." Rosa Delgado, the only family attorney within an hour's drive who wasn't already retained by somebody in the county, agreed to take our case for a payment plan I could barely afford, and she spent 2 weeks building a file. Medical records showing Claire's bruise had been photographed and documented at an urgent care clinic in Boston the week before she fled. A former housekeeper of the Ashford family willing to testify, quietly and at great personal risk, about hearing Diane Ashford discuss sending Claire away to, in her words, handle the situation before the wedding, and bank records showing that Claire had never once received financial support from Weston or his family during her pregnancy despite their public claims of caring for her. And every piece of paper Rosa found made the same picture clearer, that the Ashfords hadn't lost a baby, they'd lost control of one, and control was the only thing that family had ever actually loved. I wasn't about to hand him over to that and hope for the best, and Daniel just nodded like he understood exactly what I meant, because in a town like Rivergate, people mostly do. Later, when the guests had gone and the porch lights were the only thing still on, Claire and I sat on the same steps where she'd read as a teenager and where I'd once promised her a fair arrangement instead of a real marriage. And she leaned into my side and said the thing I think about more than almost anything else from that whole year, quiet half into my shoulder like she wasn't even sure she meant to say it out loud. She said, "He's yours now, that's what the note said." But I think what I really meant, even before I understood it myself, was that we both were. And I think some part of me knew that the night I found you standing in my driveway, because I never once thought of it as taking in a stranger's child. I thought of it as somebody finally bringing me home. If you've ever stood in a doorway holding something you didn't ask for and felt your whole life quietly rearrange itself around it, you already know there's no going back from a moment like that. And I wouldn't trade it, not the fear, not the courtroom, not one single sleepless night. Because every hard thing that came after that laundry basket on my porch led me to the family I'd stopped believing I was allowed to have. I heard much later secondhand through Denise that she'd sent a card on Micah's first birthday, nothing more, and Sarah had kept it. Unopened in a drawer, not out of spite, she told me, but because some doors take longer to decide about than others. We got married the following spring, a small ceremony in the lot behind the diner. String lights hung between the porch posts Otis and I had built the week before. Micah in a little suit that made him look like he was attending his first business meeting rather than his mother's wedding. Priya cried through the whole thing and blamed it on allergies. Father Alvarez officiated, and when he asked if anyone objected, the only sound was the wind moving through the maple trees at the edge of the lot. And I remember thinking that even the quiet felt like it was on our side. In my vows, I told Sarah that I used to think the diner was the last piece of Claire I had left, the only thing keeping her memory alive, and that I'd been afraid for a long time that loving anyone else would mean losing that. But somewhere in the last year, I'd learned that love doesn't work like a room with only so much space in it. It expands. Claire gave me a place that taught me how to make people feel welcome, and Sarah and Micah were the ones who reminded me why that mattered in the first place. I told her I wasn't just choosing her. I was choosing to keep showing up every single day. The way she'd shown up in a doorway soaked to the skin and asked for nothing but shelter. Sarah's vows were shorter, and she said them looking straight at me instead of down at the paper in her hands. "You didn't rescue me," she said. "I want to be clear about that, because I spent a long time being angry at the idea that I needed rescuing. What you did was simpler than that and harder than that. You just refused to let me believe I was alone. Every single day since that storm, you've kept refusing. I don't think I'll ever be able to thank you enough for that, so I'm just going to keep showing up too, for as long as you'll have me." 2 years after that storm, we added a second bedroom above the kitchen because our daughter Grace was born that winter, named for reasons Sarah understood without me having to explain them fully. Micah calls me Dad now without hesitation, the word settling into our house like it had always belonged there. The diner is busier than it's been in years, partly because people around here like a good story and ours has made its way through every booth in town, but mostly, I think, because Sarah brought back something the place had been missing since I lost Claire, a kind of warmth that isn't about the food at all. Some nights, after we've closed up and the kids are finally asleep, Sarah and I sit in the good booth by the heater vent, the one that never gets cold even in January, and we don't say much of anything. We just sit there the way we did that very first night, except now the silence between us isn't full of fear. It's full of everything that came after. People ask me sometimes how a storm and a stranger and a baby who wasn't even crying turned into an entire family, and I tell them the truth, which is that I don't think it was the storm that did it. I think it was 11 words spoken by a woman who expected to be turned away and wasn't. "Please, just let us sit here until the rain stops." I think about that sentence more than almost anything else in my life, because it taught me that sometimes the biggest thing you can offer somebody isn't a rescue at all. It's just a door that stays open a little longer than it has to, and a chair that's still warm when they finally sit down. If you've ever been the one standing outside in the rain wondering if anyone would let you in, I hope you find your version of that door. And if you've ever been the one who gets to open it, I hope you take the chance, because you never know whose whole life is waiting on the other side of that single, small yes.